A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine you are 3 years deep into a Mexican drug cartel. You have seen things that would give most people nightmares for a decade. You have the cell phone numbers of the top lieutenants. You know where the money is buried, and you have documented the entire supply chain. Then, you bring it all to a prosecutor, and they tell you that not a single word of it can be used in court because you didn't follow the specific chain of custody for a single bag of white powder. That was the reality of Operation Moonshot back in 2019. It is the ultimate nightmare for law enforcement, and it is exactly what we are digging into today.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, you hit on the exact nerve that makes police work so much more bureaucratic and, in many ways, more difficult than what we see at the Central Intelligence Agency. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the operational reality of police undercover work versus the high-stakes world of international espionage. Daniel wants us to look at the distinction between gathering evidence for a courtroom and gathering intelligence for a briefing, and how these officers survive the aftermath. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash.
It is funny because when we think of spies, we think of James Bond. But as we have talked about before, real intelligence officers are usually just middle managers in suits running local sources. But the police? They're the ones actually living the legend. They're the ones sitting in the back of the smoky bars at 3 in the morning. It is much closer to the Hollywood trope, but with a lot more paperwork and a lot more lawyers breathing down your neck.
The fundamental difference comes down to one word: admissibility. If you are a case officer for an intelligence agency, your goal is strategic awareness. You want to know what the adversary is planning so your government can make better decisions. You can use hearsay, you can use unverified tips, and you can even use information obtained through methods that would be laughed out of a criminal court. But for a police officer, if it isn't evidence, it doesn't exist.
Think about the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. In the intelligence world, if you get a tip from a hacked server that a foreign power is moving missiles, nobody cares if the search was legal under the Fourth Amendment. You act on it. But in a police investigation, if that initial hack was illegal, every single piece of information that flows from it, the warehouse location, the names of the drivers, the drugs themselves, it all gets tossed. You could have a literal mountain of cocaine in front of a judge, and if the entry wasn't perfect, the judge has to look at that mountain and say, "I see nothing."
And that creates this massive intelligence to evidence gap. I mean, police departments worldwide spend something like $2.3 billion annually on undercover operations, yet roughly 40% of those cases run into some kind of evidentiary challenge that limits the prosecution. Why is that gap so hard to bridge?
Is it just a matter of poor training? Or is the law actually designed to make it this difficult? Because it feels like we are asking these officers to be world-class actors and constitutional scholars at the same time.
It's both. Because the standards are worlds apart. In the world of human intelligence, or HUMINT, you are looking for the what. In law enforcement, you are looking for the who and the how. Can I prove it to 12 random people in a jury box? If a spy finds out a shipment is coming in, they tell their boss, and the boss moves a carrier strike group. If an undercover cop finds out a shipment is coming in, they have to ensure they are wearing a wire. The wire is recording in a format that meets state evidence standards, the battery doesn't die, and they don't accidentally violate the suspect's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure while they are finding.
It is like playing a video game on ultra-hard mode where one wrong dialogue choice doesn't just kill your character, it sets a triple homicide suspect free on a technicality. You mentioned the legend earlier. For those who don't know the lingo, That is the fake identity, right? How deep does that go for a modern undercover officer in 2026?
It is incredibly deep and getting deeper because of the digital world. It used to be you just needed a fake driver's license and a believable backstory. Now, you need a 15-year digital footprint. You need a social media history that doesn't look like it was created by a government bot 3 weeks ago. You need a LinkedIn profile that shows you were fired from a real job in 2022. If a gang member searches your name and finds nothing, you are dead. In the intelligence world, if you're burned, you usually just get expelled from the country. In the police world, if you're burned, you're in a ditch.
But how do they actually build that footprint without involving real people? If I'm an undercover, and my legend says I went to Ohio State, do they have to hack the university registrar? Or do they just hope the cartel doesn't have a guy in the admissions office?
It's actually more collaborative now. Under the covert identities protocols, federal agencies have agreements with certain institutions. They might enroll an identity that doesn't exist. But the real challenge is the social proof. You need people commenting on your photos from 5 years ago. You need a digital history of buying lawnmower parts on eBay. If your digital life starts the day you join the task force, you are a red flag. This is why some officers are groomed for years before they ever step into a room with the target. They live their undercover life in their off hours just to build the data.
So wait, are these officers essentially working 2 jobs for years? One as a beat cop and one as his ghost person? How do they keep the story straight? If you're at a PTA meeting for your real kids, but your digital profile says you were at a dive bar in Detroit that night, doesn't that create a trail of contradictions?
It's a logistical nightmare. They use compartmentalized devices and strict geofencing. An officer might have a legend phone that they only turn on when they are in a specific geographic area that matches their fake life. But you're right, the cognitive load is immense. There was a case in 2024 where an undercover almost blew his cover because he used his real wife's Netflix password on a clean laptop. The algorithm suggested a show he'd been watching at home, and the target, who was a tech-savvy money launderer, noticed the continue watching list didn't match the persona of a lonely bachelor.
That is terrifying. 1. Are you still watching? Prompt away from a shallow grave. And that is the irony Daniel pointed out. The spy in the CIA is usually the handler, the guy in the suit. The source is the local guy taking the risk. But in policing, the officer is the source. They are the ones doing the bywalks and the by-busts. For the uninitiated, Herman, break down what a bywalk actually looks like. It sounds like a stroll through the park, but I am guessing it is slightly more stressful.
A bywalk is where the undercover officer buys illegal goods, usually drugs or firearms, and then just walks away. They don't make an arrest. The goal is to build rapport and climb the ladder to a higher ranking target. A buy-bust is the finale, where the money changes hands and the tactical teams swarm in. The bywalk is where the evidence gathering is most dangerous because you have to maintain the persona over multiple transactions. You are essentially committing crimes to prove crimes, which brings up the whole overt act requirement. To maintain cover, these officers often have to actively participate in the criminal enterprise.
That has to be a legal minefield. How do they handle the unclean hands problem? If I am an undercover cop and I help hijack a truck to prove I am part of the gang, am I not just a high-paid hijacker at that point?
That is exactly where the legal frameworks like Title III wiretaps and state-level undercover statutes come in. There is a very thin line between investigative necessity and entrapment. The officer has to prove that the criminal was predisposed to commit the crime anyway. But you are right. The psychological toll of going native or developing a form of Stockholm Syndrome is a massive concern for behavioral science units. You are spending more time with criminals than your own family. You start to see the world through their eyes.
I imagine the debriefing for that is intense. You can't just go home and have dinner with your wife after spending 12 hours talking about how to dispose of a body. How does the department ensure the officer doesn't actually become the person they are pretending to be?
They use backstopping psychologists. These are clinicians who are cleared for the operation and meet with the officer in safe houses that look like normal apartments. They look for signs of identity bleed. That's when the officer starts using the slang of the gang in their personal life, or when they start feeling more loyalty to the crew than to the precinct. In the intelligence world, going native is a risk, but in the police world, it's a legal catastrophe because it ruins the officer's credibility as a witness. If the defense can prove you enjoyed the crimes too much, the jury won't trust your testimony.
But how do they handle the actual physical evidence during those bywalks? If I buy a kilo of heroin as an undercover, I can't exactly just throw it in my trunk and drive home. There has to be a handoff, right? But every person who touches that bag is another link in the chain of custody that a defense attorney can attack.
You've nailed the chain of custody paradox. Every time that evidence changes hands, it creates a paperwork event. Usually, there is a cover team or a shadow car nearby. The undercover will drop the evidence in a prearranged dead drop location, like a specific trash can or a locker, and the shadow team picks it up immediately. But here's the catch. The undercover has to document that drop without appearing to document it. If they are caught taking a photo of the trash can, they're dead. So they use hidden cameras, often buttonhole or eyeglass cameras, to record the entire sequence. If the camera fails, the evidence is vulnerable to the tampering argument in court.
I can see why the paperwork is so intense. You have to document every single moment to prove you didn't cross that line. But let's look at the parallel construction issue. I have heard this term tossed around in the context of the FBI. It is basically when you have intelligence that you can't use in court, so you have to reinvent the discovery of that information through normal police work, right?
Precisely. Well, not precisely. Let's say that is a good way to frame it. Imagine the National Security Agency intercepts a call through a FISA warrant, that is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. They hear a cartel boss talking about a drug warehouse. Now, they can't just walk into court and say the NSA was listening to this guy's satellite phone, because that would expose classified collection methods, so they tip off the local police. The police then have to find a legal reason to pull over a truck coming out of that warehouse, maybe a broken tail light, and then get a drug dog to sniff the tires. That dog gives them probable cause to search the warehouse. The evidence in court is the dog's hit, not the NSA intercept.
But wait, isn't that lying to the court? If the officer says, I pulled him over for a taillight, but the real reason was a top-secret satellite intercept, doesn't that violate the Brady Rule about disclosing exculpatory evidence or just the general requirement for honesty?
It is a massive point of contention for civil liberties groups. The government argues that as long as the tail light was actually broken and the dog actually hit, the search is legal on its own merits. The origin of the tip is considered sensitive investigative technique, but defense attorneys call it evidence laundering. They argue that by hiding the original source, the government is preventing the defense from challenging the legality of the initial intercept. If that satellite intercept was actually illegal, the whole tail light stop should be suppressed. But if the defense never knows about the satellite, they can't challenge it.
It feels a little bit like cheating, but I guess it is the only way to protect the sources and methods of the intelligence community while still getting a conviction. But what happens if the parallel event doesn't happen? What if the truck driver is a perfect driver? No broken lights, no speeding, stays perfectly in the lines. Does the police officer just have to let the truck go, even though they know it's full of fentanyl?
In theory, yes. They have to wait for a clean opportunity. This is why walling off is so important. The officers on the street are often not told the true source of the tip. They are just told, watch this truck, find a legal reason to stop it. If they can't find one, the operation fails. But in practice, let's be honest, if you follow any car for 20 miles, they will eventually fail to signal for the full 100 feet or touch a white line. The law gives police a lot of pretextual leeway. The Supreme Court case Warren v. United States basically said that as long as there is a technical traffic violation, the officer's real motive for the stop doesn't matter.
That is a huge amount of power. But Daniel's prompt also touches on the protection side of things. What happens when the case ends? In 2026, you can't just move to a new town and call yourself John Smith. Everyone has a camera in their pocket, and facial recognition is everywhere.
This is honestly the most terrifying part of the job now. We are seeing a massive shift in how departments handle post-operation security. There is usually a 72-hour extraction window. Once the arrests are made, the undercover officer is pulled out immediately. Their legend is retired. But the digital ghosting is what is really sophisticated now. Specialized units spend months scrubbing the officer's true identity. They remove property records, they wipe voter registrations, and they even have to manage the social media footprints of the officer's family members.
Because if a gang member is sitting in a prison cell for 20 years, he has plenty of time to hire a digital private investigator to find where the cops' kids go to school. We saw this with the Matthew Fazzaro case in 2022, right? He was an undercover who got doxxed 5 years after his operation ended.
That case changed everything. Fazzaro had successfully prosecuted a major gang, moved away, and started a new life. But a gang associate used a basic AI-driven facial recognition tool on an old wedding photo that a distant relative had posted on Facebook. They matched his face to a public record from his new town. The threat started within 48 hours. It led to the Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act, which we are seeing play out in 2026. It makes the malicious publication of an officer's home address a federal crime.
But how do you stop a relative from posting a photo? You can't put an officer's entire extended family under a gag order for the rest of their lives. That seems impossible to police.
It is nearly impossible. Departments are now doing digital hygiene training for the families of undercover candidates before they even get the job. They basically say, if your son takes this assignment, you can never post a photo of him again. You can't tag him. You can't even mention his real name in relation to his career. For a lot of families, that's a deal breaker. It's a level of isolation that people associate with witness protection, but these officers aren't criminals, they're employees.
Think about the psychological impact on the family, too. You're essentially telling a mother she can't celebrate her son's promotion, or post a picture of him at a birthday party for the next 30 years. It turns the entire family into a covert cell. Does the department provide any support for the families, or are they just expected to figure it out?
Some of the larger agencies, like the DEA or the FBI, have family support circles. These are groups where spouses can talk to other spouses who are in the same boat without breaking operational security. But for smaller municipal departments, it's much rougher. You might have a detective in a mid-sized city who goes undercover against a local biker gang, and the department just doesn't have the budget for a full digital scrub. In those cases, the officer often just has to rely on hope and a very high fence.
It is a cat and mouse game. Criminal organizations are now using the same AI tools we talk about. They are scanning social media to unmask undercovers before they even get close. How does a police department fight back against that? Is the era of the deep cover officer just over?
Not over, but evolving. We are seeing adversarial AI being used by agencies to create digital noise. They will create hundreds of fake profiles that look like the officer, all living in different cities, all with different jobs. It is essentially a digital smokescreen. If a criminal runs a search, they get 500 hits, and they have no idea which one is the real person. They are also using synthetic identities, deep fake personas that have no real human behind them, for the initial phases of an investigation.
That is wild. So you might be chatting with a gang recruit on an encrypted app who literally doesn't exist in the physical world. It is a bot or a specialized operator using a voice-modulated persona. That feels very cyberpunk, Herman.
It is the only way to survive. The Moscow rules that the CIA used during the Cold War, things like always have a backup plan and never trust anyone, are being adapted for the digital age. Police units are now hiring former intelligence tradecraft experts to teach officers how to manage their signature. Your signature isn't just your name, it is your gait, your speech patterns, the way you use emojis in a text message. If you always use the rocket ship emoji, and then your undercover persona starts using the 100 emoji, a sophisticated criminal AI might flag that as a personality shift.
Wait. Are you saying cartels are using behavioral analytics on text messages to spot cops?
We have seen reports of high-level syndicates using linguistic analysis software. They feed all the messages from their members into a model, and if one person's syntax or vocabulary starts to deviate, or if it matches the standard police report style of writing, they get flagged for a vibe check. And a vibe check in a cartel is usually a one-way trip to a basement. It's why undercover training now includes slang immersion. You aren't just learning the words, you're learning the cadence of a specific subculture so you don't trigger the algorithm.
It's the ultimate Turing test. If you can't convince the cartel's AI that you're a scumbag, you don't get the job. But let's go back to the intelligence evidence bridge. If a bot is doing the initial chatting, how do you introduce those logs into court? Do you have to call the programmer as a witness?
That's a hot legal battle right now. In some jurisdictions, the AI logs are treated like a silent witness, similar to a security camera. But defense attorneys are arguing that since an AI can be hallucinatory or biased, those logs shouldn't be admissible without a human handler who can swear to their accuracy. We are seeing the first AI officer suppression hearings this year, and the results are mixed. Some judges love the objectivity, others find it Orwellian and a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to confront your accuser.
I was reading about Operation Trojan Shield. That was the Anam case Daniel mentioned. That is probably the best example of this intelligence evidence hybrid. Yeah, the FBI literally built an entire encrypted phone company from the ground up. They didn't just infiltrate a criminal network. They own the network's communication infrastructure.
That was a masterclass in operational security. They distributed 12,000 encrypted devices to criminal syndicates in over 100 countries. For 3 years, they sat back and watched every single message. But here is the kicker. They didn't just use it for intelligence. They built the system so that every message was a signed digital record that could be used as evidence in court. They bypassed the conversion problem by making the intelligence gathering process evidentiary from day one. It led to 800 arrests.
But that took 3 years of setup. Most municipal police departments don't have 3 years and $100 million to build a fake phone company. They're dealing with the local street gang that is tearing up a neighborhood now. How do they balance that tactical necessity with the long-term safety of the officer?
Often they don't do it well. That is why we see so many cases of burnout and PTSD in undercover units. The pressure to get the win often outweighs the long-term protection protocols. But in 2026, we are seeing a shift toward intelligence-led policing. Instead of just sending a guy in and hoping for the best, they use big data and network analysis to identify the critical nodes in a criminal organization. They only send an undercover in when they have a surgical target. It reduces the time the officer has to spend in the wild.
So it's more like a short-term infiltration rather than the years-long deep cover.
The Donnie Brasco model is becoming a liability. The longer you're in, the more digital exhaust you create, and the more likely you are to be caught by a facial recognition scan or a data breach. If the local gym's database gets hacked and your real name is in there with your undercover photo, you're done. By keeping operations to 90 days or less, you minimize the exposure window.
But does 90 days give you enough time to actually reach the kingpin? Usually, the top guys don't meet new recruits for months or years. If we move to this short-term model, aren't we just catching the low-level street dealers and missing the big fish?
That is the trade-off. You might not get the godfather, but you get the lieutenant who has the keys to the server. Modern policing is moving toward disruption rather than decapitation. If you can take out the logistics guy and the money guy in 90 days, the organization collapses anyway, even if the top guy is still sitting in his villa. It's a more sustainable model for the officer's mental health, but it's less satisfying for the war on drugs narrative that wants a big trophy at the end.
But what about the agent provocateur issue? We've seen a lot of scrutiny in the UK and here in the US about undercover officers pushing people to commit crimes they wouldn't have otherwise. If you're only there for 90 days, aren't you under more pressure to make something happen to justify the cost?
That is the big ethical risk. The undercover policing inquiry in the UK has been a massive wake-up call. They found officers who had entered into decades-long romantic relationships and even fathered children while undercover. That is a total failure of command and control. In the US, the outrageous government conduct defense is a real threat to prosecutors. If a judge thinks the undercover officer was the primary driver of the crime, like if the cop provides the gun, the car, and the plan, and the criminal just shows up, the whole case gets tossed.
It is a delicate dance. You have to be criminal enough to be trusted, but legal enough to be a witness. I think people forget that at the end of the day, that officer has to sit in a witness stand, look the defendant in the eye, and explain everything they did. That takes a specific kind of person. A sloth like me could never do it. I would forget my fake name by lunchtime.
Well, slots have a very low signature quorum. You might actually be the perfect undercover. No one suspects the guy who takes 4 hours to order a coffee. But you hit on a good point. The personality profile for this work is unique. You need someone with high empathy to build rapport, but high compartmentalization so they don't lose their own identity. They actually look for low reactivity individuals, people whose heart rates don't spike when they lie.
That sounds like a sociopath, Herman. Are we just hiring good sociopaths to catch bad sociopaths?
There's a fine line. The difference is the prosocial motivation. A sociopath manipulates for personal gain, and Undercover manipulates for a specific legal outcome. But the psychological overlap is why the screening is so intense. They use the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, to weed out people who might actually enjoy the deception too much. You want someone who can lie, but who feels a moral weight when they do it. If they don't feel the weight, they'll eventually stop reporting back to their handlers.
How often does that actually happen? The going rogue scenario. We see it in movies all the time. The cop who realizes the cartel pays better and has better benefits. Is that a real-world statistical threat?
It's rare, but it's catastrophic when it happens. The most famous cases usually involve the green wall officers who start taking small bribes to look the other way and eventually become full-time assets for the gang. In 2023, there was a case in Southern California where an undercover task force was essentially running its own drug ring. They were skimming from the seizures and using the legend to sell the product. The check and balance is the handler. Every undercover has a handler who they have to check in with every single day. If you miss a check-in, the tactical team is at your door in 10 minutes. It's not about trust, it's about a system of constant verification.
So, let's talk takeaways. If you're in the security field or just interested in how this affects the world, what should we be looking at? To me, it seems like the evidentiary burden is actually what makes police work harder than spying. Spies can be messy. Cops have to be perfect.
That is the big one. Intelligence is what you know. Evidence is what you can prove. If you are in corporate security or threat intelligence, you should be looking at how parallel construction can protect your own internal investigations. You might find a bad actor through a messy method, like an anonymous tip or a gray area data scrape, but you need to build a clean path to the evidence if you want to fire them or sue them without getting hit with a countersuit. You have to act like a cop, even if you started like a spy.
And for the average person, the lesson is that your digital footprint is permanent. If the police are spending millions to create digital ghosts for their officers, it shows you just how easy it is to be tracked in 2026. The retribution timeline is now essentially forever, because the internet doesn't forget. If you're ever in a position where you need to disappear, you're not just fighting people, you're fighting the archive data of the entire world.
Well, it is a lifelong commitment. Post-operation protection isn't a program you finish, it is a way of life. The rise of synthetic identities is something to watch too. As it becomes harder to be a real person in an undercover role, we might see the emergence of AI-first investigations where the human only steps in at the very last moment. Imagine an AI that spends 2 years becoming the best friend of a money launderer online, only for a human officer to show up for the final meeting.
That is a terrifying thought. An AI undercover that can't be doxxed because there is no house to firebomb. But then you run back into the admissibility problem. Can a bot testify in court? Can you cross-examine an algorithm?
Not yet, but give it a few years. We are already seeing AI-assisted testimony where data is presented in a way that proves the bot's observations were accurate. The legal system is slow, but it's moving toward accepting digital testimony as long as the underlying code is transparent. But for now, we still need the brave and perhaps slightly crazy men and women willing to live a lie for a few years to bring some truth to a courtroom.
It's also about the human element of juries. A jury might not convict based on a bot's log, but they will convict when they see a human being who risked their life to get that information. There's a moral weight to undercover work that an algorithm can't replicate. People want to see the hero who went into the lion's den.
True, but that hero is often a broken person by the time they get to court. The aftercare for these officers is the next great frontier in police reform. We need to treat them like combat veterans because that's essentially what they are. They've been behind enemy lines for years, often without the support of a platoon.
It is a wild world, Daniel. Thanks for the prompt. It really highlights how the glamour of Hollywood is actually just a mountain of legal briefs, psychological strain, and a lot of looking over your shoulder. It's not just about wearing a leather jacket and riding a motorcycle. It's about making sure your motorcycle's registration matches a fake address that has a real-looking utility bill attached to it.
It really is. It's the bureaucracy of the shadows. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show's infrastructure.
If you want to dive deeper into our archives, check us out at myweirdprompts.com. We have all the RSS links and ways to subscribe right there. We've got episodes on everything from AI ethics to the history of the dead drop.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
Stay safe out there, and maybe check your privacy settings one more time. Seriously, that photo from your 2014 vacation might be the thing that burns your cover in 2030.
Good luck with that. Bye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious.